4 inches of snow and 40-mile-per-hour whipping winds plagued the small town of Boone, North Carolina on February 3, 1972. Clyde Townsend Road was a steep, dead-end road off of the North Carolina Route 105 bypass on Boone's west side, and the Durham family had just moved into their home from Mount Airy in 1971. The Durhams were a modest, quiet, and hard-working family of 4, comprised of Bryce Durham, who owned a Buick dealership, Virginia Durham, who kept the books for Bryce, and Bobby Durham, their 18-year-old son, who was attending his first year at Appalachian State University. They also had a daughter, Jenny Sue Hall, who had gotten married to her husband Troy Hall, and they had a home 4 miles away from where her parents and brother lived. We are here at Crime Labs today to tell their story. Please visit the links in the description to hear the full story on the Cola City Crime Podcast. There are reports from a close neighbor that they saw Bobby go up the hill after driving home around 9 p.m. that night, and then the Durham family sat down on the couch to eat dinner. Right around the time they started to eat, Virginia made a phone call. That phone call was so short that Virginia only had time to talk to Troy and had said in a panic, 3 black men had Bryce and Bobby Joe beating them in the back room. Troy maybe thought it was a joke, but Jenny said her mother wouldn't joke about something like that, so they tried repeatedly to call back, only to receive a busy signal every time. They decided that, since they were only 4 miles away, to jump into their car and drive to the Durham home. However, their car wouldn't start, so they called a neighbor to ask for a ride there. Coincidentally, their neighbor, a man named Cecil Small, was a private investigator and the manager of the mobile home park where they lived. So, they all hopped into Cecil's car and drove over to the Durham home, and when they arrived, they parked down the hill, and Jenny sat in the car while her husband and Cecil trekked up to the house with his gun. When the house was in view, they noticed that all the lights were on. They entered through the garage and noticed that the house was destroyed, and one of the downstairs landlines was ripped off the wall. The men immediately noticed that the TV was still on, and there was blood spatter around the den, but they were distracted by the sound of running water. So they started looking all over the house for the source of the sound, and when they got to the bathroom, they were not at all prepared for what they were about to see. All 3 family members were hogtied, kneeling on the floor of the bathroom, with their heads hung over the tub, with the water still running, but the overflow drain kept it from spilling onto the floor. Through an autopsy, it was determined that Bryce and Bobby had been strangled with a rope and then drowned, and Virginia had also been strangled and then drowned to death. Cecil and Troy immediately ran back to the car. Their car slid off the road, so they went to a nearby neighbor and decided to call the police. Police arrived at the scene, got their car back on the road, and then they all drove over to the Durham home to assess the crime scene. Troy and Cecil led them through the garage, where they had previously accessed the home, and led them to the bathroom. The investigation started immediately. They were able to determine that Bobby had been the first person to go into the tub to be drowned, then his father Bryce, and then finally his mother Virginia. This allowed investigators to determine the time of death for the family was around 10 p.m. that night. Police's first theory was that it was possibly a robbery gone wrong, and that they knew it was committed by multiple assailants simply because both parents were healthy and Bobby Joe was young and athletic, so the thought of all 3 being murdered by just one person was not possible. The home was indeed robbed of some valuables, however a substantial amount of cash was left in an envelope on a kitchen chair. Police did not find any footprints or tire prints, considering the 40-mile-per-hour winds covered everything immediately in snow. The Jimmy was nowhere to be found on the property, but officers surveilling the roads near the home for anything suspicious found it just a few miles away on Poplar Grove Road with the engine still running, lights on, and windshield wipers going. There was also a pillowcase full of the Durham family silverware found on the back seat, and police determined that the four-wheeler came off the hill between 10:20 and 10:30 p.m. There was a report that whomever was driving the four-wheeler was speeding and actually almost ran someone off the road that night. So, if we remember from the phone call that Virginia made to her daughter's home and spoke to Troy that night, she had mentioned that the assailants were 3 black men. Police initially looked into that theory. However, during 1972 in Boone, it was highly unlikely that you would find a single black man, let alone 3, to commit a crime together, since the population of less than 3,000 people was predominantly white. Of course, with the lack of evidence and motive, there were a ton of ideas being thrown around back in the 70s and 80s. This case would go without any real leads until 2019. We will start with the first theory that comes with a confession. Now, this confession was never recanted, but ended up being dropped due to the lack of evidence. 20-year-old Dean Chandler was in police custody in Tennessee for unrelated charges when he made a phone call to the Boone sheriff, claiming that he wasn't involved firsthand. He promised that the case would be split wide open as long as he agreed to drop the larceny charges against his wife, Elizabeth Ann. He admitted to being the one that cased the house and set it up for 3 men to rob, and those 3 men he mentioned were Jerry Casada, age 28, Eugene Guerin, age 22, and Henry Coffey, age 21. On April 22nd, police arrested Jerry and Eugene, and then on April 26th, Henry turned himself in as well. A pre-trial began on June 15, 1972, but due to the lack of physical evidence, they were released in September. Second theory. Some parts of this theory were widely believed by law enforcement and many people around Boone. This is that Troy and Jenny committed the murders either separately or together as a team. Why would they decide to murder Jenny's whole family? Well, it was public knowledge in Boone, a town of about 3,000 people at the time, that the Durhams were laying the pressure on for Jenny to leave Troy. Allegedly, and none of this was completely confirmed, but it was believed that Jenny dropped out of college and was using drugs at the time, and her marriage with Troy was not going well, which caused a strained relationship between her and her parents. So on the afternoon of the murders, Troy was seen by a friend, whom they spoke to briefly, and then left the local library around 8 p.m. He then went straight home and arrived back home around 10 p.m. to meet Jenny, where she had been all afternoon and evening. The Winter Olympics came on that night, but the broadcast was interrupted by the storm after only 20 minutes, and that's when Virginia had called them. This is when the Halls decided Virginia's phone call was not a joke, and tried to start their car, which wouldn't, and then they enlisted the help of their neighbor. Wade Carroll, who was a previous Watauga County sheriff, admitted 10 years after the murders that he didn't think the phone call was ever made by Virginia, and stated that when some people come into your house to kill you, they're not going to let you make a phone call. Unfortunately, we are talking about 1972, so at that point it was impossible to check records of local calls made. Interestingly enough, the estimated time of the TV going out would have been about 10:20 p.m. after the Durhams were already murdered, and this is when the assailants were seen fleeing the scene. So, how do you talk to someone who is already dead? Was Troy over the strained relationship with the family? Was Jenny greedy, knowing that she was their sole heir to any money or possessions they had? Jenny and Troy moved shortly after the murders and eventually divorced in 1976, and they went their separate ways. Neither one of them would respond to interview requests, but Jenny had recently remarried, and her new husband finally released a statement after much pressure from law enforcement stating, after all the time she spent in the past with the State Bureau, being put under hypnosis, there was nothing she knew to help. I can tell you right now, she has nothing left to say. Another theory is that the murders were a well-calculated contract hit and little to no evidence left at the scene. Investigators collected several fingerprints, but none ever found a match in the system, which many locals believed that the Green Berets from the Rotary meeting had been involved in the murders, and many knew that this was how they killed people in Vietnam. Were the Durhams involved with drugs? Did they have a bad business deal? Or maybe the mob ordered the hit? Of course, this brought on more speculation and questions about the case with no answers. With the minimal evidence and leads, police hired a clairvoyant to check the crime scene. They pointed out the exact spot that the Jimmy was found without any previous details given, and they also said that 4 to 5 men were involved in the murders, but they couldn't give any of those men's names, so police took this information with a grain of salt. Bryce's parents, Coy and Callie Durham, put up a reward of $35,000 plus $5,000 from the government for any information leading to an arrest. Over 200 people have been interviewed since the murders, and the fingerprints that were collected from the scene have been rechecked each year to hopefully find a match. The case became cold at least until 2019. Investigators' big break would come from a man named Shane Burt, son of Billy Burt, who paid a visit to the White County Sheriff's Office in Georgia. Shane was actually researching for a book about various crimes around Georgia, which included a crime committed in 1973 named the Fleming case, which authorities noticed the similarities to the Durham family case, where 4 suspects committed the murders. According to Watauga officials, Shane Burt was very close with his father and recalled a story Burt had told him during a prison visit when he admitted to killing 3 people in the North Carolina mountains during a heavy snowstorm, remembering that they almost got caught. After hearing Shane Burt's account, the White County Sheriff's Office immediately contacted WCSO. The 4 suspects allegedly connected to the Fleming case were tied to an organized crime ring known as the Dixie Mafia. This mafia was led by Billy Burt and also included others, Billy Davis, Reed, and Gaddis, and they were thought to engage in dozens of violent crimes in not only Georgia, but many other places across the Southeast in the 1960s and 70s. Mr. Davis, age 81, the only suspect in the Durham killings who is still alive, is already serving a life sentence in a Georgia prison for another murder. Let's hold a moment of silence for the Durham family. Tune in to the Cola City Crime Podcast and the links in the description to hear more about this case. Thanks for watching Crime Labs. Please visit our channel to watch our playlists.